Good evening, everybody. Really an extraordinary evening, and I hope I can keep up with all the presentations and all the acts and wonderful music and everything we've had so far. So let me jump right into presenting this award to Alexander Kmentt. Ambassador Alexander Kmentt is the Director for Arms Control, Non-Proliferation and Disarmament in the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a position he has held since 2011. He played a central role in organizing the recent international conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in December 2014 in Vienna, which attracted delegates from 158 countries, the United Nations, and civil society, including myself, actually. Prior to his assuming his current position, Ambassador Kmentt was a special assistant to the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, we say CTBTO, in Vienna from 2006 to 2011. Prior to 2006, he served in various offices in the Austrian Foreign Ministry, including the Department for International Organizations, the Department of Humanitarian and Refugee Affairs, and for 6 months at the Austrian Embassy in Prague, Czech Republic. In 2005, he was appointed Deputy Director of the Department for Disarmament Affairs and head of the Unit for Nuclear Issues, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, the CTBTO, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. He's been a leading advocate for disarmament for many years and was so recognized earlier this year as Arms Control Person of the Year, quote unquote, by the members of the US-based Arms Control Association. He's also served as Austria's Deputy Representative to the Conference on Disarmament, what we call the CD, in Geneva, Switzerland. The International Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons last December took place in the historic Hofburg Palace, which my wife and I, Debbie, just visited 2 weeks ago in Vienna, and was the third such event after prior conferences in Norway in 2013 and Mexico in 2014. In an interview last August, Ambassador Kmentt described the upcoming international conference as follows, and I quote, "The purpose of the conference from the Austrian perspective is to create and generate as much momentum for nuclear disarmament as possible. We think that some of the key findings are clear. For instance, the consequence of nuclear weapons use, if you look at health, environment, social order, economy, food security, these consequences are far greater than we had previously thought, and there are research findings suggesting that the consequence of the next nuclear weapons use would be far greater than the tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki." The chairman's summary of this December 2014 Vienna conference noted the following, amongst many other conclusions, and I quote again, "As long as nuclear weapons exist, there remains the possibility of a nuclear weapon explosion. Even if the probability is considered low, given the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear weapon detonation, the risk is unacceptable. The risks of accidental, mistaken, unauthorized, or intentional use of nuclear weapons are evident due to the vulnerability of nuclear command and control networks to human error and cyber attacks, the maintaining of nuclear arsenals on high levels of alert, forward deployment, and their modernization. These risks increase over time. The dangers of access to nuclear weapons and related materials by non-state actors, particularly terrorist groups, persist. The catastrophic consequences of a nuclear weapon detonation event and the risks associated with the mere existence of these weapons raise profound ethical and moral questions on a level transcending legal discussions and interpretations," unquote. And I continue to quote, "It was recognized that the obligation to pursue effective measures for nuclear disarmament, as expressed in Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, resides with each state party, and that there are practical steps that states can take now to pursue such measures in good faith." And I continue to quote, "Participants at the Vienna conference were conscious that 2015 marks the 70th anniversary of the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that calls for nuclear disarmament in this connection have been palpable and poignant. They consider that it is critical to sustain partnerships among states, the Red Cross movement, international organizations, parliamentarians, and civil society with view to translating the widespread concerns about the risks and consequences associated with nuclear weapons into concerted efforts to achieve a world without these armaments." End quote. Daryl Kimball, Executive Director of the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C. here, commented after the Vienna meeting we were both at, Ambassador Kmentt deserves enormous credit for making the third conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons the most inclusive and extensive yet. The Vienna conference has changed the international conversation about nuclear weapons and provided renewed urgency to the effort to move toward a world free of nuclear weapons, end quote. Unfortunately, the 5-year Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference held in New York City in May of this year, just a few months ago, ended with no final agreed statement and was generally perceived as a failure in moving the nuclear disarmament agenda forward. In a closing statement delivered on behalf of the 49 states of the NPT at the NPT conference in New York, Ambassador Kmentt acknowledged that there was, and I quote, a wide divide, unquote, on disarmament between the nuclear weapon and non-nuclear weapon states, and I quote, a reality gap, a credibility gap, a confidence gap, and a moral gap. End quote. Those are a lot of gaps. In a May 18th statement during the conference, Kmentt expressed concern that successive drafts of the final document, and I quote, were getting weakened overall. Does this sound familiar to anybody? In the face of an overwhelming majority calling for a strengthened document with clear obligations, concrete commitments, and timelines, end quote. In an effort to push the nuclear-armed states to accelerate the pace of progress on disarmament, a group of 159 countries, that's about 3/4 of the world, endorsed a statement delivered by Austrian Foreign Minister Sebastian Kurz on April 28, 2015, this year, citing the findings of 3 international conferences on humanitarian consequences, and I quote, the catastrophic effects of a nuclear weapon detonation, whether by accident, miscalculation, or design, cannot be adequately addressed, end quote. In an article last December, was entitled How Divergent Views of Nuclear Disarmament Threaten the NPT, Ambassador Kmentt argued for a world without nuclear weapons, echoing the 2009 Prague statement we're all familiar with from President Barack Obama. And I quote from his article, as long as nuclear weapons exist, the risk of their use by design, miscalculation, accident, or madness remains real. Any use of nuclear weapons would cause unthinkable humanitarian emergencies and have catastrophic global consequences on the environment, climate, health, social order, human development, and economy. The more the world understands about the global humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, the stronger the case against them becomes. Viewed against such a background, nuclear weapons are not reconcilable with the 21st century understanding of international law, and in particular, international humanitarian law. In an age of globalization and in light of the uncontrollable destructive capability of nuclear weapons, such a broadening of the discourse was overdue. These aspects should be at the core of the international community's nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation efforts. Given the increased global attention, it is now clear that the humanitarian dimension will play a central role in the NPT discourse and beyond, end quote. Ambassador Kmentt also argued for public engagement, greater transparency, thereby increasing pressure on nuclear powers to give up their nuclear weapons and meet their legal obligations. And one more quote. Nuclear weapon states have boycotted or rejected the above initiatives with the utterly unconvincing argument that they would distract from the NPT and the implementation of the 2010 action plan of the NPT. In truth, these initiatives do not distract from anything, but rather focus the attention of governments and the wider public on the importance of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. Against the background of a broader societal debate, it will become more and more difficult to sustain the arguments in favor of retention of nuclear weapons. Instead of resisting and acting to undermine efforts by non-nuclear weapon states and civil society, nuclear weapon states should start to embrace a different discourse on nuclear weapons themselves and move seriously toward their elimination. This would be the most sustainable and credible way of contributing to the integrity of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and retaining it as a key instrument of collective security. The Nuclear Free Future Foundation is pleased thereby and honored and proud to honor Austrian Ambassador Alexander Kmentt with its 2015 Special Recognition Award for working tirelessly for a world free of nuclear weapons. And we thank Ambassador Kmentt for successfully raising the humanitarian impacts of these weapons of mass destruction and for his ongoing support for open and inclusive public involvement. With time, we are convinced, I am convinced, we will all see a world truly free of all weapons of mass destruction. Ambassador Kmentt.
As a diplomat working for a foreign ministry, one is not used to and certainly doesn't expect to be recognized for the work one is doing personally. So I feel, of course, extremely fortunate and privileged and grateful to receive this great honor today, especially given the amazing determination and great accomplishment of my fellow award winners. I have not walked hundreds of kilometers in freezing rain. I have not sat in prison. I'm sitting in diplomatic meetings and doing my work there.
It's the same.
It's not the same. I would like to thank the Nuclear Free Future Award very, very much for giving me this award, and also thanks a lot to Paul Walker for the very, very kind words that he said. This is, of course, a special day for me personally, but I understand at the same time that I'm receiving the award representing the humanitarian initiative that Paul has explained. This initiative, into which Austria is heavily invested, and so are many, many other states. And this initiative is the real winner. I had the pleasure and responsibility to organize for the Austrian Foreign Ministry this conference last September, and in this period I sometimes thought that this conference would cost me my job. Instead, a few months later I'm receiving rewards for it, so I'm extremely happy about that. The humanitarian initiative and the support it has generated are maybe first of all a manifestation of discontent of the vast majority of states with the status quo on those issues. It's a manifestation that there's no readiness of nuclear possessor states, nuclear weapons possessor states, to take the real and credible steps away from nuclear weapons reliance and the nuclear deterrence-based security approach. The nuclear disarmament obligations and the commitments given over many years under the NPT are simply not fulfilled. Quite the opposite. There are plans and budget allocations in place in all the nuclear possessor states to modernize and to invest into the long-term possession of nuclear weapons. This, in our view, profoundly undermines trust in the NPT and in the entire disarmament and non-proliferation regime. The humanitarian initiative is also a manifestation of the wish of all states to have a stake in the nuclear weapons debate. Nuclear weapons are not just a security issue for states who have them. Their existence and the risks that come with nuclear weapons are a security issue for all states and their peoples. Whose security are we talking about in the nuclear weapons debate? What is the legitimacy of a selective security approach in the 21st century? The humanitarian initiative, through the 3 international conferences in Norway, Mexico, and Austria, dedicated to discussing the humanitarian impact and the risks associated with nuclear weapons, have produced some very disconcerting evidence, and Paul has pointed to some. It's that the impact of nuclear weapons, the immediate, the mid and long-term consequences, would be significantly graver than it was previously understood. We need to look at the consequences in their entirety: the health, food security, climate, economic, migration movement, social order consequences, and specifically the interrelationship of these consequences. If we really imagine these consequences, they are unimaginable. They would be devastating. Moreover, we understand now more about the risks associated with nuclear weapons. They're also significantly greater than previously assumed. Nuclear weapons are complex machines that are designed and operated by humans. Like every other construct, nuclear weapons and the human beings involved in operating them and in making the decisions, they are fallible. Human errors, miscalculations, technical faults. All of this has happened in the past. Sometimes very serious incidents. Often we've just been incredibly lucky. This risk of something going wrong cannot be eliminated, and is in fact growing with more and more actors and the risk of further proliferation. And all of this is exacerbated by the clear warning of all international humanitarian organizations, from the United Nations to the Red Cross, that no national or international capacity exists capable of adequately responding to the humanitarian harm that would result from a nuclear weapon explosion, certainly in a populated area. And there aren't even any plans, because this is, in most cases, because this is considered by those actors as beyond the pale for planning. It has been said that these findings are not new, but that's not true, because the extent and the magnitude, as well as the combined effects of consequences and risks, that is new, and it's highly disconcerting and should compel the international community to urgent action. So based on these conclusions and the arguments, the arguments for the retention of nuclear weapons, for the very concept of nuclear deterrence, are considered now by more and more states as a high risk and ultimately irresponsible gamble based on an illusion of security and safety. At the closing conference of the Vienna conference last December, Austria undertook a national commitment, which we called the Austrian Pledge. It says in a nutshell that we need to put the humanitarian concerns at the center of the nuclear weapons debate, and that we need to identify and pursue effective measures to fill the legal gap. That's not just moral credibility and other gaps, it's specifically a legal gap that needs to be filled for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons, and that we need to cooperate internationally in efforts to stigmatize, prohibit, and eliminate nuclear weapons in light of their unacceptable humanitarian consequences and associated risks. And since then, in a way to our amazement, 120 countries have formally endorsed this pledge, which we renamed Humanitarian Pledge to underscore its now clearly international character. We are currently working in New York, together with many states during the UN General Assembly, of course against very stiff opposition, but we are working to further increase support for this initiative, and this support is growing. I too feel passionate about the dangers stemming from nuclear weapons, and I'm genuinely worried that we're living on borrowed time. The sword of Damocles that President Kennedy referred to still hangs above our head, and the longer it does, the greater the likelihood becomes that it will fall, and this is not rocket science. While the humanitarian initiative has generated a remarkable momentum, and I think we can be very proud, we at the same time have to be honest, because what have we achieved so far? We have changed the nuclear discourse, we have seen a greater engagement by civil society, but the governments in nuclear weapon states and their allies have not responded to these calls, specifically not to the calls for urgency, for more urgency, and the expressions of concerns. Rather, we see even some digging in that in the current geopolitical development, further nuclear disarmament steps are more difficult. I strongly believe that the current situation makes disarmament efforts, specifically nuclear disarmament efforts, and the move away from nuclear weapons reliance all the more important. We are at the cusp of either returning back to a Cold War, mutually assured destruction, illusion of security unless urgent action is taken. And from the Austrian perspective, right in the middle of Europe, this is very reminiscent to the situation we were in the Cold War. For this, we need a broad societal engagement of the nuclear weapons issue and an understanding of the unacceptable existential threat that all humanity continues to face. This is the only way to force real change on this issue. Humanitarian arguments, in my view, are a chance to take the discourse away from limited security expert circles to civil society and grassroots. We've made some headway, but it's nowhere near enough. And I need to say on this occasion, I'm proud that I've made some headway in my family, because my 18-year-old daughter has become an active member of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And I'm very proud of that. So let me thank you very much for this award, also from the perspective that it is an important contribution to further raising awareness about the humanitarian initiative and the urgent need to move away from the dangerous and unsustainable nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence system. Thank you very much.